Send us your finest human groom, the treaty had said, but somewhere between Earth and the stars, the universe chose a wheat farmer instead. The wind rolled slowly across the plains of New Terra Colony, bending acres of golden wheat like waves on a quiet ocean, and Ethan Carter stood in the middle of it with grease on his hands and a wrench tucked into his back pocket, staring at a stubborn irrigation drone that refused to spin. He wiped sweat from his forehead with the sleeve of his flannel shirt and glanced toward the horizon where the late afternoon sun hung low, turning the fields amber and copper. Out here, life moved at a simple rhythm measured in rainfall, soil moisture, and the steady hum of old machines that worked harder than most people ever would. Ethan liked it that way. He had lived on this frontier colony for 11 years, long enough to know the sound of every tractor engine on his land and the smell of rain before it reached the ground. The rest of the galaxy, politics, diplomacy, interstellar arguments, felt very far away. At least it had until the sky darkened without a cloud in sight. Ethan noticed it first as a shadow sliding across the wheat, a slow dimming of sunlight that made him look up with one hand shielding his eyes. What he saw above the quiet farmland was not a storm. It was a ship. No, several ships. Smooth silver shapes hung in the sky like silent mountains, their hulls catching the fading sunlight in sharp reflections. They moved without sound, without smoke, without anything that resembled the noisy engines Ethan was used to fixing. For a long moment he simply stared, because a farmer spends most of his life solving problems he understands, broken pumps, bad soil, wandering cattle, but nothing in Ethan Carter's experience explained why alien vessels were hovering above his wheat fields. Somewhere beyond the hills a transport shuttle began descending, its glow bright enough to paint the barn roof in pale blue light. Ethan exhaled slowly and reached down to shut off the irrigation unit, the motor winding down with a tired click. Well, he muttered to himself, brushing dirt from his jeans, that's new. The shuttle settled at the edge of his property with surprising gentleness, flattening a circle of wheat but raising almost no dust. The ramp lowered with quiet precision, and figures stepped out, tall, poised, wearing armor that shimmered like polished glass. At their center walked someone different. Someone smaller. Someone who carried herself with the unmistakable posture of authority. Princess Lyra Vethari had traveled across 3 star systems expecting to meet humanity's greatest champion. A decorated general, perhaps. A brilliant diplomat. Someone worthy of representing an entire species in the most important treaty her empire had ever signed. Instead, the first human she saw was standing beside a muddy tractor with a wrench in his hand and a puzzled expression on his face. Ethan watched the group approach slowly through the wheat, their blue-tinted skin glowing softly in the fading light, and he realized 2 things at once. First, they were definitely not tourists, and second, they were walking directly toward him. The princess stopped a few yards away, studying him as if he were an unusual artifact someone had left in the wrong museum. Ethan scratched the back of his neck, glanced at the flattened wheat around the shuttle, and finally said the only thing that seemed appropriate. So, are you folks here about the crops, or did somebody get very lost? Princess Lyra Vethari did not answer immediately. She simply stood there in the quiet field, the evening wind brushing through the wheat around her silver boots while her violet eyes studied the human in front of her with careful disbelief. This was not the moment she had imagined during the long journey across the stars. The Royal Archives had described humans as unpredictable, ambitious, even dangerous in the right circumstances. None of those descriptions seemed to match the man currently wiping engine grease from his hands onto an old cloth while looking at her landing craft with mild concern for his crops. Behind Lyra, her imperial attendants exchanged brief glances, unsure whether to speak first or wait for the princess. Finally one of them stepped forward, tall and composed, holding a thin tablet that projected faint blue symbols into the air. The translator device hummed softly before converting the alien language into clear English. The voice that emerged sounded calm and official. Citizen Ethan Carter, resident of Agricultural Sector 17, New Terra Colony. Your presence is required under authority of the Interstellar Accord between the Aurelian Empire and the United Nations of Earth. Ethan blinked once. He glanced behind himself as if expecting to see Someone else standing there who might actually belong in that sentence. There was no one. Only wheat fields stretching for miles and the distant shape of his red barn catching the last orange light of sunset. "You sure you have the right guy?" he asked slowly. "Because the most official thing I did today was repair a broken irrigation valve." The translator repeated his words perfectly. Several of the attendants seemed uncertain how to respond to the casual tone. Lyra finally took a step forward, her posture perfectly balanced, every movement carrying the quiet authority of someone raised among royalty. Up close she was even more striking, her turquoise skin reflecting the fading sunlight like polished glass and a thin silver crest resting against dark hair braided behind her head. She studied Ethan as if measuring something invisible. "You are Ethan Carter," she said, her voice firm yet controlled. The translator carried the words smoothly into English. Ethan nodded once. "Last time I checked." For a brief second the princess seemed almost puzzled by his calm expression. Most humans, according to the reports she had read, reacted to the presence of imperial authority with a mixture of awe and nervous respect. This one simply looked curious, as if strangers landing spacecraft in his wheat field was only a minor inconvenience. Lyra lifted one hand and a small holographic document appeared between them, lines of glowing text drifting slowly in the air. "A treaty was signed between our civilizations 3 months ago," she explained. "One of its conditions requires the union of an Aurelian royal heir with a human representative chosen by neutral selection." Ethan listened carefully, though his expression did not change much. The wind shifted again across the wheat, carrying the faint smell of soil and dry grass. Somewhere near the barn a small utility drone chirped softly as it finished scanning the irrigation line. "All right," he said after a moment. "That sounds important." Lyra nodded once. "It is extremely important." Ethan rubbed the back of his neck and looked out across the golden field, thinking through what she had just said in the same steady way he usually approached farm problems. Then he looked back at her. "So which representative are you supposed to meet?" For the first time since stepping onto the planet, Princess Lyra hesitated. The silence stretched just long enough for the wind to rustle through the wheat again. Then she answered, her eyes fixed on his with quiet certainty. "You." For a moment Ethan Carter simply stared at her, certain he had misunderstood something in the translation. The wind moved slowly across the wheat behind him and the long shadows of evening stretched across the field, but the princess did not move and neither did her attendants. She was serious. Ethan let out a small breath and looked around again at the quiet farmland as if the answer might be written somewhere between the rows of grain. "You mean me personally," he said carefully. "Not humanity in general. Not the governor of the colony. Not somebody wearing a suit in Washington." The translator repeated his words and Lyra gave a single calm nod. "You were selected through the neutral compatibility protocol defined by the treaty. The process evaluates psychological stability, cooperative behavior, and biological viability for long-term diplomatic partnership." Ethan listened politely, although the explanation only made the situation sound stranger. He looked down at his hands, still marked with thin lines of oil from the irrigation unit, and then back at the princess standing in immaculate ceremonial armor. The contrast between them was almost comical. "I fix water pumps," he said. "That is the most complicated thing I usually do." One of the imperial attendants adjusted the glowing tablet and spoke quietly with another officer in their own language, their voices soft and melodic. Lyra remained focused on Ethan as if she were studying an unfamiliar puzzle. According to the data files she had read during the voyage, humanity valued ambition, achievement, and leadership. The human chosen to stand beside an imperial princess should have represented the very best of those qualities. Yet the selection algorithm had pointed them here, to a farmer standing in the middle of a wheat field with a tractor idling nearby. Ethan finally rested the wrench on the tractor tire and folded his arms across his chest, not defensively but thoughtfully. "Let me see if I understand this correctly," he said. Some computer somewhere looked across the entire planet and decided the best human to marry an alien princess is the guy whose biggest concern today was whether the north irrigation pipe was clogged. The translator carried the sentence perfectly, and for the first time a faint ripple of uncertainty passed through the Imperial group. Lyra did not smile, but there was a flicker of curiosity in her eyes. The protocol is rarely incorrect, she replied. It was designed to find individuals who embody the cooperative potential of their species. Ethan considered that for a moment, then glanced toward the flattened patch of wheat near the shuttle. Well, it definitely found the wheat, he said quietly. The breeze carried the dry rustling sound of grain brushing together, and the sky above them deepened into early twilight. A few faint stars were beginning to appear beyond the hovering fleet far above the colony. Ethan shifted his weight slightly and looked back at the princess with the same steady calm he used when dealing with stubborn machinery. Princess Lyra, he said, speaking her name carefully, I am not trying to be difficult here. But if this is some kind of mistake, you might want to double-check before the paperwork gets too serious. Lyra studied him again, longer this time. There was no arrogance in his tone, no attempt to impress her, and no sign of fear. He simply spoke with the quiet confidence of someone used to solving practical problems one step at a time. After a moment she lifted her hand and the holographic document brightened between them, displaying the final line of the selection report. The glowing text rotated slowly in the evening air. There has already been a double verification, she said calmly. The treaty does not contain an error. Ethan followed the light of the hologram with his eyes, then looked back at her. So what you are saying, he said slowly, is that I just got volunteered for the strangest job in the galaxy. Lyra's gaze did not waver. Yes, she answered simply. You did. The wind grew cooler as evening settled over the fields, carrying the earthy smell of soil and dry wheat, while the alien ships remained suspended far above like silent stars that had decided to stop moving. Ethan Carter stood beside his tractor with his arms loosely crossed, studying the glowing treaty text floating in the air as if it were another piece of equipment he needed to figure out. Finally he sighed and rubbed the back of his neck again, a habit he had whenever a problem appeared larger than expected. All right, he said slowly, let us say the computer is correct and I am the lucky winner of this galactic lottery. What exactly happens next? Princess Lyra watched him with the same composed focus she had shown since arriving, though now there was a trace of curiosity behind her calm expression. She had expected confusion, possibly resistance, perhaps even excitement from a human suddenly chosen for royal alliance. Instead, Ethan sounded like a man discussing weather patterns before harvest. According to the treaty, she replied, the selected human representative must agree to accompany the imperial delegation and participate in a formal diplomatic union that will symbolize peaceful cooperation between our civilizations. Ethan glanced at the wide field around him and then toward the old red barn about 200 yards away, its wooden doors glowing orange in the last sunlight. The barn had been built by the first settlers of the colony, and he had spent years repairing the roof, reinforcing the beams, and installing the small solar panels that powered the property. It was not much compared to an interstellar palace, but it was home. Accompany you where? He asked. One of the attendants answered this time, his translator speaking with polite precision. Initially to the Imperial diplomatic station orbiting this world. Later possibly to the Aurelian capital depending on treaty progression. Ethan nodded slowly as if someone had just explained a long delivery route. Then he looked at the princess again. That sounds like a lot of travel for a man who still has half a wheat field that needs harvesting. For the first time one of the attendants seemed unsure whether the human was joking. Lyra however watched Ethan more closely than before. The reports had described humans as impulsive and emotional creatures, yet the farmer standing in front of her showed neither panic nor pride. Only steady thought. You would be compensated, she said carefully. Your government has already agreed to provide financial and legal arrangements for your property during the diplomatic period. Ethan nodded once but did not look impressed. Instead he walked a few steps toward the crushed patch of wheat left by the shuttle and gently lifted one bent stalk between his fingers, checking the grain the way farmers do when deciding the right time to harvest. The alien delegation watched silently, uncertain why the chosen representative of humanity seemed more concerned with crops than royal agreements. Ethan studied the grain for a moment and then let the stalk fall back into place. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "most people would probably panic if a princess landed in their field and asked them to leave the planet." Lyra tilted her head slightly. "And you are not panicking." Ethan gave a small shrug and looked out across the quiet farmland where the last sunlight was fading into deep blue evening. "No," he said calmly. "But I do have a question." The princess waited. Ethan turned back toward her, his voice steady and sincere. "If I go with you," he said, "who is going to help you learn how to grow wheat?" The question lingered in the evening air like the last light on the horizon. Princess Lyra Vethari had faced senators, admirals, and imperial strategists during her life, yet none of them had ever asked her something so strangely simple. Who would teach her how to grow wheat? For a moment the princess looked out across the endless rows of golden plants moving gently in the wind. The field stretched nearly half a mile from the barn to the small tree line in the distance, every stalk bending in quiet rhythm beneath the darkening sky. It was peaceful in a way that felt unfamiliar to someone raised in marble halls and diplomatic chambers. Ethan Carter followed her gaze and rested both hands on the side of the tractor, the metal still warm from the afternoon sun. "I am serious," he added calmly. "This colony survives because people know how to grow things out here. Wheat, corn, beans, whatever the soil allows. It does not look like much from space, but it feeds thousands of families." One of the imperial attendants glanced down at the tablet in his hands as if trying to locate agricultural statistics that might explain the importance of this moment. Lyra remained quiet. She had studied human political systems and technological achievements before arriving on this world, but the quiet logic of a farmer discussing food production had never appeared in the diplomatic briefings. Ethan stepped away from the tractor and walked a few yards into the field, gently pushing aside a row of wheat with his hands as if inviting the princess to follow. After a short pause Lyra stepped forward as well, her silver boots brushing softly through the grain. The attendants remained behind, uncertain whether royal protocol allowed wandering into farmland during treaty negotiations. Ethan bent slightly and picked a single wheat head from one stalk, rolling it carefully between his fingers. "See this," he said, holding it up so she could see the small grains inside. "When it turns the right color, you know harvest is close. Too early and the grain is weak. Too late and the wind takes half of it away." The translator echoed his words, but the tone of his voice carried something the machine could not fully explain. Patience. Lyra leaned closer, studying the plant with quiet interest. The tiny grains reflected the fading sunlight like pieces of pale gold. "Your species measures success through agriculture," she observed. Ethan shook his head gently. "Not success. Survival." The evening breeze moved across the field again, brushing through both of them as the sky slowly filled with deeper shades of blue. For a moment neither of them spoke. Finally Lyra looked back toward the distant barn and the simple farmhouse beside it. The structure was small, built of wood and steel panels patched together over many years. It was nothing like the towering palaces of her home world, yet something about its quiet presence made her pause. "Your home is there," she said. Ethan nodded. 210 yards that way. Kitchen is small but the coffee is strong. One of the attendants shifted uneasily, clearly uncomfortable with how casually the human was speaking to an imperial heir. Lyra however continued studying the farmer with growing curiosity. "You are surprisingly calm for someone who has just been selected for a diplomatic union with an alien princess," she said. Ethan looked down at the wheat again and then back toward the distant barn before answering. "Princess," he said gently, "when a storm shows up in the middle of harvest season, a farmer does not panic. He figures out how to work with the weather." Lyra considered his words for a long moment. Then she asked the question that had been forming in her mind since the shuttle touched down. "And what exactly do you think I am?" she said quietly. Ethan gave a small thoughtful smile. "Right now," he answered, "you look like someone who has never had dinner in a farmhouse before." Princess Lyra Vethari had attended thousands of diplomatic functions in her life, each one governed by strict schedules, ceremonial rules, and carefully rehearsed conversations, yet the simple invitation offered by the farmer standing in the wheat field felt more uncertain than any imperial negotiation she had ever faced. Dinner in a farmhouse. The words sounded strangely ordinary. She glanced toward the distant building Ethan had pointed out earlier, the small structure sitting quietly against the horizon with a single porch light beginning to glow as the sky darkened into night. The wind moved softly through the wheat again, brushing against her ceremonial armor with a faint whispering sound that reminded her how far she was from the polished marble halls of her home world. Ethan Carter watched her reaction with patient calm, the same expression he probably used when waiting for a tractor engine to warm up on a cold morning. "It is nothing fancy," he said after a moment, gesturing casually toward the farmhouse about 200 yards away. "But I figure if we are going to talk about something as big as a galactic treaty, it might help to do it somewhere comfortable." Behind the princess, several members of the imperial delegation shifted uneasily. One of them stepped forward slightly and spoke in a careful tone after the translator activated. "Your Highness, protocol recommends returning to the shuttle so proper diplomatic preparations can be arranged." Lyra heard the concern in his voice. Royal heirs did not normally wander into unknown buildings on distant colonies without security clearance and formal inspection. Yet she continued looking at the farmhouse, noting the small details she had not noticed before. A wooden swing hung on the porch, gently moving in the breeze. Soft yellow light shone through the kitchen window, suggesting warmth inside despite the cool evening air. It looked less like a place of political importance and more like a place where people simply lived. Ethan noticed the hesitation and gave a small shrug. "You can bring the whole crew if that makes it easier," he said calmly. "I have got enough chairs. And if we run out, there is always the porch." The translator repeated his words and one of the attendants blinked in confusion at the idea of imperial officers sitting on a wooden porch during treaty discussions. Lyra however felt something unexpected stirring in her thoughts. Since childhood she had been trained to see diplomacy as strategy, alliances as calculated balance between powerful civilizations. Yet the human standing in front of her did not treat the moment like a negotiation at all. He treated it like welcoming a guest. She slowly turned back toward him. "You are inviting an alien delegation into your home," she said, her tone carrying genuine curiosity. Ethan nodded once. "That is how people usually start conversations around here." He glanced toward the sky where the distant fleet still hovered silently above the colony like a cluster of unmoving stars. "Besides," he added, "it is getting late and nobody makes good decisions on an empty stomach." The quiet confidence in his voice seemed completely unaffected by the presence of imperial officers, royal titles, or the enormous political weight of the treaty itself. Lyra studied him carefully, realizing that this farmer possessed something none of the royal advisors had mentioned in their reports about humanity. A kind of steady grounded logic that came from living close to the land. Finally she made a small gesture with her hand, signaling the attendants to remain calm. "Very well," she said. "We will accept your invitation." Ethan smiled faintly and brushed the last bit of dust from his hands before turning toward the path leading through the wheat field to the farmhouse. As they began walking together through the quiet rows of grain, the princess found herself wondering about something she had never considered during all her diplomatic training. What if understanding humanity did not begin in government buildings or council chambers at all? What if it began somewhere much simpler, like a small kitchen on a farm at the edge of a wheat field under a sky full of unfamiliar stars? The path from the wheat field to the farmhouse was narrow but familiar to Ethan Carter, worn smooth by years of quiet evenings walking home after long days in the sun, and tonight the small trail felt strangely different with an alien princess walking beside him while a handful of cautious imperial attendants followed several steps behind. The wheat brushed gently against their legs as they moved through the rows, the soft rustling sound blending with the distant hum of night insects beginning their chorus across the colony. Above them the sky had darkened completely, revealing a wide blanket of stars that stretched across the horizon while the distant fleet remained suspended like silent guardians watching the quiet farmland below. Ethan walked with relaxed steps, his boots pressing lightly into the dry soil, occasionally glancing back to make sure his unexpected guests were keeping up. Princess Lyra moved carefully at first, the unfamiliar ground beneath her boots reminding her how different this world was from the polished floors of imperial palaces. The smell of earth and grain surrounded them, something simple yet strangely comforting. After a moment she spoke. "Your world is quiet," she said thoughtfully, her voice carried through the translator with gentle clarity. Ethan nodded without slowing his pace. "Out here it usually is," he replied. "Most excitement we get is when a rainstorm shows up earlier than expected." Lyra considered that answer while they continued toward the farmhouse porch light glowing warmly in the distance. She had spent years studying reports about humanity, learning about their rapid technological growth and their sometimes chaotic political systems, yet none of those reports mentioned evenings like this. Even the imperial attendants behind them seemed unsure how to interpret the situation, their formal posture slightly awkward among the swaying rows of grain. As they reached the edge of the field the ground changed from soil to the packed dirt path leading directly to the house. The wooden structure stood quietly beneath a tall porch lamp that cast a warm yellow circle across the front steps. A rocking chair moved gently in the night breeze and the soft sound of wind chimes hung near the door, creating a delicate metallic tone each time the air shifted. Ethan climbed the 3 wooden steps and reached for the door with casual familiarity before turning back toward the princess. "Welcome to my place," he said simply. Lyra paused at the base of the steps for a moment, studying the small house carefully. It was not large, perhaps a little more than 1,000 square feet from what she could estimate, yet every detail suggested care. Fresh paint covered the wooden walls, a small garden grew beside the porch, and a row of boots rested neatly beside the door. It felt less like a building and more like a life built slowly over time. She stepped onto the porch and listened as the wood creaked softly beneath her weight. Inside the house a faint golden light spilled through the doorway as Ethan pushed it open. The warm smell of cooked bread and roasted vegetables drifted into the night air, carrying a quiet promise of comfort that felt strangely unfamiliar to someone raised among formal banquets and ceremonial meals. Ethan stepped inside first and moved toward the kitchen counter where a cast iron pan still rested on the stove. He lifted the lid and nodded with satisfaction before glancing back toward his guests. "Hope nobody here is afraid of simple cooking," he said with a relaxed smile. Princess Lyra stepped through the doorway slowly, her eyes adjusting to the warm light of the farmhouse interior while the attendants followed carefully behind her. The room was modest but welcoming, filled with wooden cabinets, a round dining table, and shelves lined with jars and small tools. Nothing about it was grand or impressive by imperial standards, yet the quiet atmosphere carried something that Lyra had not expected to feel on this distant colony. Peace. She looked toward Ethan as he placed several plates on the table and realized something surprising. The farmer who had been chosen by a galactic treaty was not acting like a representative of an entire species. He was simply acting like a host welcoming guests into his home, and somehow that simple gesture felt more important than any diplomatic ceremony she had ever attended. The farmhouse kitchen filled slowly with the quiet sounds of an ordinary evening, something so simple that none of the imperial attendants quite knew how to react to it. Ethan Carter moved around the stove with practiced ease, setting warm bread on the wooden table and placing a large bowl of roasted vegetables beside it while the gentle scent of garlic and herbs drifted through the room. Outside the windows the night had settled across the wheat fields, the distant rows of grain glowing silver beneath the moonlight while the alien fleet remained high above the planet like silent observers to a moment no diplomatic record had ever predicted. Princess Lyra Vethari stood near the doorway for a moment before stepping fully into the kitchen, her eyes slowly exploring the room. Every surface carried signs of daily life. A faded photograph rested on a shelf beside a stack of handwritten notes about crop rotation. A small calendar hung beside the refrigerator with planting dates circled in blue ink. Even the wooden table itself showed the faint marks of years of meals and quiet conversations. None of it was impressive by imperial standards, yet the space felt alive in a way the polished halls of the palace never had. Ethan pulled out a chair and gestured toward the table with casual hospitality. "Please sit," he said. "Dinner is ready and it tastes better when people actually sit down." The translator repeated his words and Lyra took the offered seat, noticing the way the wooden chair creaked softly beneath her weight. Around her the attendants remained standing for a moment, uncertain whether royal protocol allowed such an informal arrangement. Ethan noticed their hesitation and simply shrugged. "There are enough chairs for everyone," he said calmly. "And if anyone is worried about protocol, the table does not seem to mind." One of the attendants slowly sat down, then another, until the small kitchen table held both humans and Aurelians in an arrangement no diplomatic council had ever imagined. Ethan placed the final plate in front of the princess and nodded toward the food. "Nothing complicated," he said. "Just vegetables from the garden and bread from the oven." Lyra looked down at the meal, the warm light reflecting softly from the simple dish. On her home world food often arrived in elaborate presentations prepared by royal chefs, yet this plate carried something different. It carried effort. Ethan took his own seat and began pouring water into a row of glasses before finally speaking again. "You said earlier that the treaty was meant to represent cooperation between our civilizations," he said thoughtfully. "But cooperation usually starts with understanding each other first." Lyra lifted a piece of bread and studied it carefully before answering. "Understanding is often difficult between species that evolved on different worlds," she replied. Ethan nodded and took a small bite of his own meal before responding. "Maybe," he said calmly. "But hunger is the same everywhere." The translator repeated his words and a quiet moment followed while everyone considered the meaning behind such a simple statement. Outside the farmhouse a gentle wind moved across the wheat fields again, brushing through the tall stalks like a quiet ocean under the moon. Lyra tasted the bread slowly, surprised by its warmth and texture, and realized that the farmer across the table had already begun doing something no treaty clause could truly force. He was showing her the ordinary rhythm of human life. Not through speeches or negotiations, but through a shared meal in a small farmhouse kitchen. She looked up at Ethan and asked a question that had slowly formed in her thoughts since entering the house. "You knew nothing about our empire before today," she said softly. Ethan gave a small smile and wiped his hands on a cloth beside the table. "That is true," he answered. Lyra watched him carefully before asking the question that truly mattered. "Then why are you treating us like friends?" Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair and glanced toward the dark wheat fields outside the window before giving the simplest answer of all. "Because," he said quietly, "that is usually the best place to start." The quiet conversation around the farmhouse table continued long after the plates had been cleared, the small kitchen now filled with the softer rhythm of evening rather than the careful tension that had followed the alien delegation into the house. Outside the windows the wheat field stretched beneath the moonlight like a silver ocean, and the distant stars above New Terra colony shone calmly despite the massive fleet that still waited silently in orbit. Ethan Carter leaned back slightly in his wooden chair, a mug of warm coffee resting in his hands, while across the table Princess Lyra Vethari studied the room with thoughtful eyes. Something had changed during the meal, though it was difficult to name exactly what it was. The imperial attendants who had once stood rigidly behind her now sat more comfortably in their chairs, their earlier formality softened by the ordinary human habit of sharing food and conversation. Lyra looked toward the window where the moonlight touched the edge of the wheat fields and spoke quietly. When I left my home world, I believed this treaty was a calculated decision, she said. Two civilizations balancing power through diplomacy. Ethan nodded slowly as he followed her gaze toward the quiet farmland outside. That sounds like the kind of thing governments usually do, he replied. Lyra turned back toward him, her expression calm but thoughtful. Yet what I have seen tonight does not resemble political calculation. Ethan smiled faintly and set the mug down on the table. That is because it is not politics, he said gently. It is just life. The translator carried his words across the room and a moment of quiet reflection followed. Lyra rested her hands lightly on the wooden table, feeling the smooth surface beneath her fingers, and realized something that none of her advisors had predicted. The treaty had not brought her to a battlefield or a negotiation chamber. It had brought her to a kitchen table on a quiet farm at the edge of human space. She looked toward Ethan again, studying the calm confidence in his expression. You accepted this situation very quickly, she said. Ethan shrugged slightly, the movement relaxed and natural. A farmer learns early that you cannot control every storm, he answered. Sometimes the best thing you can do is step outside and see what the weather is trying to tell you. The attendants exchanged quiet glances, still unsure how such simple wisdom could carry so much meaning. Lyra considered his words for a long moment before speaking again. My empire believed humanity was unpredictable, she said slowly. Yet tonight I have discovered something different. Ethan tilted his head slightly. What is that? The princess looked around the farmhouse once more, at the wooden shelves, the small garden visible through the window, and the quiet warmth of the home that had welcomed strangers without hesitation. Then she returned her gaze to the farmer who had been chosen by a treaty written across the stars. Your people do not measure strength the same way we do, she said softly. Ethan smiled a little at that and folded his hands on the table. Maybe not, he replied. The wind outside moved gently through the wheat again, creating a soft rustling sound beneath the moonlit sky. For a moment the room remained silent except for that distant whisper of grain and the steady ticking of a small clock on the kitchen wall. Lyra Vethari looked at Ethan Carter and understood something that the Imperial Council would take years to fully explain. The peace between two worlds had not begun with fleets, laws, or royal authority. It had begun with something far simpler.